This brings us on to the relationship with America, which was still an awkward question. Wilson had called it a close relationship instead of a special relationship in 1964, even though he was pro-American. The relationship was strained because of lack of support, militarily anyway, for Vietnam by Wilson. Australia provided troops, and Lyndon B. Johnson wanted Wilson to do the same, even if it was a token gesture. They had a good relationship, but Wilson refused, and this was really to appease the anti-American left of the party. And he even refused to put in a token battalion or a military band. Both Wilson and Heath did give continued diplomatic support, but without the military support, the Americans would not help us avoid the devaluation crisis in 1967 without what they called a flag in Vietnam. Ironically, Wilson was getting it from all sides. The Americans criticised him for not intervening militarily, and the left and anti-war protesters criticised him for even giving moral support and not doing anything further to stop America in Vietnam. When Heath came to power, he resisted attempts by Nixon and Henry Kissinger to use Britain as a link to Europe. And in the Yom Kippur War, when the USA wanted to use NATO bases in Europe, Britain and other European countries refused for fear of an oil embargo from the Arab countries. This meant that relations were strained even further, but they did later recover. Overall in this period, the West seemed to be losing the Cold War, before the Soviets got involved in Afghanistan anyway. Europe in this period was a key issue, and Labour were not as keen to join the EC as Heath and Macmillan had been in the early 60s. Gaitskell had fought against the first application strongly in 1962. Jenkins and Brown were both pro-free market and for going in. Wilson was ambivalent himself, didn't mind either way, and the left were very strongly against going into the EC. Wilson did apply to join the EC again, mainly on economic grounds, but it was half-hearted in nature, and de Gaulle was still there anyway. They met though, and the meeting went quite well apparently, and Wilson managed to get parliamentary support for this application. All the Conservatives and all the Liberals voted for, and all but 36 of the Labour MPs voted for it as well, which meant it passed. De Gaulle then asked Wilson for a detachment from the special relationship, which Wilson couldn't agree to, and de Gaulle vetoed it. The 5 other countries, apart from France, were annoyed, and Wilson was humiliated. De Gaulle retired though in 1969, and the EC invited us to reapply. And when we applied the third time, the pro-European Heath, the very pro-European Heath, was in charge, and he was making it a priority. Pompidou, who replaced de Gaulle, wanted Britain in the EC. All the negotiations had already been done anyway, pretty much, and in 1973 we joined. We did join at any cost. Heath told his team to accept any terms as we could change them later. And we couldn't negotiate from a position of strength anyway. The Commonwealth special considerations for food into Britain would largely not be accepted. The advantages of joining the EC were that we gained access to European markets, were part of a European trade bloc which stood a better chance of attracting foreign trade. British regions were eligible for EEC grants, and British workers could now go and work anywhere in the EEC. Disadvantages of joining the EEC were that we were no longer able to buy cheap food from the Commonwealth, as already mentioned, and at time of entry Britain was classed as an industrial economy. This meant we had to pay higher contributions than grants that we would get from it. The Common Agricultural Policy's Dear Food policy meant inflated food prices, and the Common Fisheries Policy meant the virtual destruction of our fishing industry. VAT was also introduced as a result of the EC, and it had to be imposed on us, and it started at 8%. Protectionist organisation is the EC, and this was not a great thing in an increasingly global economy. When Wilson came back into power, he called a referendum to stop the party from splitting, and he himself stayed out of the campaign. It is the country's first ever referendum, and the yes vote won 2-1, 67%. And this appeared to settle Europe as an issue, for the while anyway. Opponents said that we should have voted on it before actually going in, and that this was a fait accompli, a done deal. The yes campaign spent twice as much as the no campaign, and the British people had never been given the full story. They were kept in the dark about political implications of Europe. it being sold on economic grounds only, with no talk of further political integration. Let's have a look at the historical interpretation on this one. Wilson said, unless Britain remains a world power, it would be nothing in 1964. He also said, when asked why we were not taking a hard line against America and Vietnam, because we can't kick our creditors in the balls. Ian Smith said, I do not believe in black majority rule in Rhodesia for 1,000 years. Chris Rowe suggests that the main unresolved issue by 1974 was Rhodesia, and also says that we seem to be turning towards Europe and away from America. Ken Morgan says the last pretense of being a world power has been stripped away in this period. And Ben Pimlett said several doubters in the Labour Party only ever supported the bid to join in 1967 because they knew de Gaulle would block it anyway. Dean Rusk, an American, said, when the Russians invade Sussex, don't expect to come over here and say you, or something like that. And Derek Murphy says, after Britain joined the EEC in January 1973, its foreign policy became more European. Andrew Marr says, on devaluation and the military cuts, those smaller pounds would buy fewer gallons of oil, fewer foreign manufactured guns, and fewer accommodation for troops. Marr also says, pro-Europeans wanted devaluation so that it would break us away from the USA. And that's it for that one. Thank you very much. Good night.